Welcome everyone. This is psychological grind, XP grind, psychological XP grind. I'm gonna get used to that. It's a new name, but anyways, I'm taking a look at video game addiction and how we kind of viewed that back in the day, meaning like prior to the past, I guess, well, 12 years. I'm looking at a time frame from 2000 to 2010 and kind of seeing like, hey, like where did we, or how did we view this back in the day? How do we actually look at this? How do we actually conceptualize addiction back in the day? And then I'm going to make another one after this, another video kind of explaining this is what this is now. There's different criteria we can use. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of look at this. The classic example and what's used a lot in the literature back in the day was they kind of, I mean, it's still actually kind of used today. They basically replicate what we know of as gambling addiction and kind of pull out the word gambling and just replace it with video games. So I can give you an example. So needs to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve the desired excitement. So you could replace needs to play video games. You could just switch that out with increasing amounts of time in order to achieve the desired excitement. Is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling or stop gaming. Like, you just replace that. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, and I'm not going to dive too much into that, meaning I'm not going to kind of talk about where we're at right now. That's not really where and what I'm talking about. This is more saying this is where we've come from, so that it kind of sets up and elaborates the next video, which will be about this is where we are currently, and this is where, hopefully we can go. And then if I'm lucky, or if I have the time after that, I can maybe even go into like what is actually used as terms of interventions currently. But as it stands, this is what I did out of curiosity. I just kind of wanted to see what amusement or humor. I kind of wanted to see what people were viewing this as, and I've seen some interesting articles. This is the only one that doesn't really meet my 2000 to 2009 criteria. This was 1994, I believe, which is hilarious because that's when I was born. Regardless, I thought that was a very fascinating look at just how long standing this has been, and they reference things from as early as 1982 right here. They have some old references themselves, so this clearly isn't something that's just new to us, which is kind of weird how long we've been actually talking about this and it's still not a formalized diagnosis, or at least further along. I mean, it's pretty far, but it's just very odd to me. But this is Sue Fisher, Department of Applied Social Science, University of Plymouth, identifying video game addiction in children and adolescents. So obviously I'm reading from this, so this is all their work. So I've highlighted a few examples of kind of going through these. I'm not going to dive into these each one. I would just want to lay these out of here's some things I picked out that were interesting in here. It might seem a little bit like cherry picking. You're more than welcome to go read through these, make sure I'm not misinterpreting something. But again, this is so old that I just did it more for fun than like a hardcore literature review or anything like that. It's just kind of a look back. So there is one I would like to show you. Okay, so one of the things that they did here was, again, they took, this is back in 1994 again, they kind of used this term that they call the DSM-4-JV, which is, I guess, what they stand for, juvenile arcade video games. So what they're looking at was arcade video games specifically. So this is old school, put the coins in kind of thing. Most people obviously knew they existed, but it's just interesting because it's more about the history and not what we actually still talk about with video games. So I find that a little fascinating. But regardless, what they're talking about here is, and the entire study was conducted with adolescents, specifically with arcade games. So putting the coins in and stuff, because that was, I guess, still prevalent back in the day. And they do discuss how obviously there was a shift to home consoles, and they even mentioned that could be problematic. And again, this is back in the day. So the scale is adapted from the DSM-4, a set of criteria shown to discriminate pathological gambling effectively in adults. Adaptive scale is presented as a DSM-4-JV, and this is something I just kind of thought. So over a decade prior to the above opinions, we were seeing academics trying to understand what addiction was for gaming, and the author made a valid point about adapting gambling into something relevant for gaming. And the author also points out the history games have with spending money on arcade machines. So this part really got me when I was researching all of this, because I actually found this article later on, and what I thought was hilarious and equally fascinating is that they, in this article, they talk about how pernicious it is, how difficult it is for children at that time to lose a shit ton of money dumping in coins. I mean, a lot for them, obviously, maybe not that much, but then again, I don't really know. Maybe I could pull up some news sites that talked about how much people actually would spend back in the day. But regardless, they're even understanding and mentioning this in that term, in those terms of money being spent. So a lot of the later literature after 1994, specifically in the 2000s, was really focused on and really looked at time being wasted, not money being wasted. So it's like, oh, we can't really use a one-to-one comparison with gambling, which you can't. But their argument a lot of the times is that it's a time thing. But this is a great example of before that, previous to that, we're saying, hey, no, this was definitely an issue considering that people used actual money and currency and would have to keep spending to further their advancement in a specific game. So I thought that was awesome and hilarious. That was one thing I just wanted to point out. Again, I'm not going to break down this whole thing. I'm not going to break down this whole article. I just wanted to say these are some points that I noticed about this. So another interesting line is, logic suggests that if arcade video games are addictive for some children, then the same games played on home computers will be similarly addictive. I cannot read along with things. That's more of a my fault kind of thing. So I was personally, like, when I read that, I was very thankful to hear that even back in the day when I was born, they were already mentioning, and this is kind of like the wrap up in their discussion part. They even mentioned, hey, like, this is an issue, like, this potentially could be an issue, I should say, with at-home video game consoles. Because this is let's see, 1994. So when I think the PS1 came out in 1994, December 3rd, 1994. So it's funny how, like, you really saw, like, the start of the new wave of consoles at this time, right before probably, like, that was even released. So clearly when they were writing this, like, the PS1 wasn't even in mind. I don't know when SNES release date 1990. So that was at that start of that new wave. So they clearly were talking about something, and that thing. When I interject something, I'm saying this is my opinion. It's not representative of me as a therapist. It's not representative of any like that or my credentials. It's more just like a personal opinion based on things I've seen, and I'm definitely, like, all this stuff again is prefaced with the idea that I'm not creating diagnosis. I'm not saying that, like, to use any of this as diagnosis. This is just for educational, informational purposes. But I thought it was interesting nonetheless. So now we're coming to the bulk of the issue, meaning this is, like, really one of the biggest articles that I had an issue with. And apparently it was pretty big back in the day because I saw a lot of different articles referencing this thing and having some sort of, I guess, opinion or review over it, or they talked about it specifically. Like, I guess this was big back in the day in this small world of academia. So this is by Richard T. A. Wood, Problems with the Concept of Video Game Addiction, Some Case Study Examples. And just as reference, this person is this Richard T. A. Wood is extremely cited, has a lot of, like, published work and stuff. So this is interesting. And of course, I don't know this person. This was, again, a long time ago. Maybe they've changed their tune. Maybe they've seen new evidence to change there. So I'm not throwing shade at this individual. I don't even know who this is. A few things I wanted to highlight in here. There's currently no such clinical criteria as video game addiction that has been accepted by any reputable organization responsible for defining disorders of the mind or body. And they are specifically talking about the American Psychiatric Association, the World Health Organization, both of which has changed over time. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. This is kind of how they perceived it. This is, again, 2007, 2008. This is how they're perceiving this issue. It's like, it doesn't really exist right now as far as reputable sources are concerned, despite, at this point, over a decade worth of relevant literature kind of pushing that. It's interesting how much they, like, don't really address that. I mean, they have, like, a lot of, like, things that they link to here. They have a ton of articles that they're clearly talking about and pulling from, but this person has a very, like, blasé kind of idea representation of video game addiction, which, again, is it's healthy to have skepticism, especially when you're talking about a diagnosis. You don't want to just start creating diagnoses out of, like, thin air and then applying them to people. That's a very dangerous and slippery slope. So throughout this article, this person also, talks about different questionnaires that are used to measure, specifically what's called addiction engagement questionnaire. I couldn't find a direct link to show you, otherwise I would show you kind of the measurements. Occasional wins. So this is this person trying to understand and talk about, or I guess describe for others, what they think addiction means and how it's applied to games. So they say occasional wins convince the problem gambler that winning back all of their money is a possibility, and the cycle of debt increases. The mounting debt leads to increased stress, and a need to gamble develops in order to alleviate that stress, and this is fueled by the delusion that more gambling will solve the problem. You're going to see this as a huge theme throughout this, as people are trying to relate gambling and video games, and we understand now, like, we get it. Everyone who's probably going to watch this video understands that gaming is pretty addictive, and there's been a lot of different studies to, I guess, point that out. A lot of different studies that have have mentioned this, or maybe like legal entities, like governance agencies, people coming out. Like, there's a whole host of things that like we know this has kind of changed over time. We know that this is something that has shifted over time. But again, I'm just looking at this in retrospect. First thing that popped in my mind is, what about SR rating? So, money aside, let's pretend loot boxes. Let's take that up and throw that shit away. Like, without loot boxes, without the gambling, without the microtransactions, what about SR rating? So it's not a gamble per se, but it's still dictated by skill. And the idea is that you want the higher SR skill rating, SR being skill rating. You want that higher SR in things like Overwatch, Valorant, World of Warcraft. You want those ratings because it's indicative of how good you are. And anytime you enter into a new match, it's not really a gamble in the traditional sense, but you are hoping that your skills will be better than the person that you're pitted against, and hoping that whatever magical like programming that's created on the back end is going to match you appropriately, and therefore you're going to have a chance to win. Now, you could say that about any sort of sporting event, but this is the first thing that popped in my mind, is just specifically deconstructing this argument that they're talking about. The mounting debt leads to increased stress, and a need to gamble develops in order to alleviate that stress. And again, I could say the same thing about like the stress of online video games, like of continuously needing to prove. If, say, you're in a very player versus player environment, that you want to do better. Now, obviously, like, you can say, oh, but what about sports? And sports a little bit different, because they're like, I guess you can keep playing like a soccer game over and over and over, but it's not nearly as accessible. You can't just like, and your body's going to give out at a certain point, whereas video games won't push you that hard. I mean, mentally, it can be exhausting, but it's not physically going to drain you, aside from the fact that you might need sleep after about 16 hours. But you can realistically sit there for 16 straight hours and hit that button and join queue, and you're never going to be able to not stop doing that. And at some point, I don't care if you're playing soccer for 2 hours or 10 hours, like, you can't just do that. And even if you did that, you couldn't wake up the next day and just keep hitting that same button over and over, meaning playing the soccer game over and over. So this is a lot different and a lot more accessible, and I think I'm throwing out the other arguments. Like, we already, again, know, but I'm just pretending that I'm in this person's head back in the day, back in 2007, 2008, of why this seems to me like on the outset already like incorrect. And my assumption is a lot of these like academics, they didn't have time to play games. They were too busy making their academic stuff and being, fruitful with their time and whatever. They clearly didn't play a lot of video games themselves. So if they did, then maybe they're skewed, and I don't know. But anyways, so another interesting thing that they bring up, because again, they use gambling a lot in this to try to make this comparison. So by comparing the action of problem gambling with excessive gaming, we are not comparing like with like. Obviously. So prior to that, he says playing for longer periods or playing more frequently does not in itself increase the overall intensity of the gaming experience, which again I still think is completely false, and is more akin to engagement criteria noted earlier. So by comparing the action of problem gambling with excessive gaming, we are not comparing like with like. And again, obviously but then again, just because you're trying to create a comparison so people have like a baseline of which to start of trying to understand video game addiction, that's just not what's really useful here. I mean, I'm sure like when gambling was becoming a thing, that gambling addiction as a thing, like we had to look at other forms of addiction, and so like you're using it as a comparison, but it's only to create a bedrock of which to like then grow further. And I do agree in that sense that yes, the comparison should eventually end. Playing for longer periods or playing more frequently does not in itself increase the overall intensity of the gaming experience. Even back in 2004, through this time, World of Warcraft being the most popular game at the time, playing more and more does increase the intensity of the gaming experience. The longer you throw yourself against a raid, the more likely you are to get the randomized loot that you want for your character. And this is a very interesting thing throughout this whole thing, is they're talking about gambling, oh, there's no probability, and it's like already false. Like already false even back in 2007, 2008 when this was written. MMOs were a thing for a long time, or any sort of, like, I think, they say Diablo 2, that is a very randomized thing, and the more you play, the more you have chances of getting that randomized loot. Just found that so interesting, so fascinating, that this person just completely refuses to make that connection, or just doesn't know, because gaming probably wasn't their world. If you're not ready for all of this, then please leave, because there is quite a few examples here. And it's mainly, again, because I want to point out, like, this idea has come a long way, and I take this idea very intense and personal. Like, this is something that I've seen and dealt with in my own life, and I've seen and dealt with it with other people in my life. And to just pretend like it doesn't exist, or that it's not an issue, that's a huge no to me, honestly. And so before I dive back into this, I'm just going to go on this point, like some random thoughts that I had while doing all of this research. One, addiction. I say addiction a lot throughout this. Addiction really isn't a term used anymore. Like, usually we call it like substance use disorder. So it's a person with substance use disorder. That's like the politically correct term. You don't want to call anyone an addict. So I'm only using addiction because a lot of this research is using addiction. Personal opinion here, I don't really agree with that. It's more of like compulsion or what have you. And I think by using addiction, it does kind of create a certain tone when you're talking about this, and kind of muddies the water and kind of creates it as like a negative or terrible thing if you were to even ever play a video game, because it's obviously not a one-to-one representation with things like hardcore drugs. That's a different ball game. It's a different world completely, and I don't really agree with using the term addiction. And so I'm glad that I think even in the DSM-5, how it's classified, it says disorder. It doesn't even say anything about addiction, or obviously it doesn't say substance use, but the word addiction, while relevant, isn't quite representative of what we're talking about. Another thing I did note was if marijuana can be classified as a use disorder, which it is, and like I'm not going to dive into the literature of like that being physiologically addictive versus not. It clearly doesn't have nearly as, even something like cocaine. I was reading an article earlier that said it was only like 16% of people who actually use cocaine during that study, like that they were looking at, that they actually developed what would classify as an addiction. Some of these harder drugs even aren't nearly as physiologically addictive. While I'm sure there is to some extent. I'm not that well versed in that, so I'm not going to go into that. But my point is if you can classify something that isn't nearly as physiological addictive as, say, heroin, or even using like gambling as a term, like I don't see why video game compulsion or whatever you want to call it couldn't be something as. But again, I'm just placing my headspace in this person's headspace, whatever. Another random thought I had during this stuff, prior to getting back to this, authors kept comparing games to physiological addiction that substances had. But I ascribe to the notion that substance use or gambling are forms of escapism from the same issues someone would use gaming as escapism for. What I mean by that is a lot of practitioners, and I know a lot of therapists will argue, or, times that I would have in my studies during my master's program, a lot of people would talk about this idea that addiction is, or whatever you want to call it, compulsion addiction, is a way of escaping. And you see this a lot in this literature, is that it's not really, they're like, oh, it's not addressing like the root problem of depression, the root problem of anxiety, or whatever. Like the person's using games as an escapism, so that it's not actually a disorder itself, the root cause is. And it's like, okay, well then, to me personally, aside from the physiological part, I'm going to use gambling again as the example here. Just because someone gambles doesn't mean the gambling also isn't a problem, because if that's the way that they're destroying their life is through gambling, while they simultaneously have depression, it's like you would probably want to address the gambling first, because of that's what the person's, like, their behaviors are actually like causing the real harm, and then after that, or simultaneously, you would address depression. But you still want to get to the root cause of it while simultaneously working with the thing that's actually creating all the issues. So it's like that already breaks down a lot of the arguments here. But anyways, I personally ascribe to the idea that escapism in general should also be addressed while simultaneously addressing something else if there's some sort of co-occurring issue. Excessive video game players do not usually end up with huge debts, and it's unlikely that a video game player will have their house repossessed because of video game play debts. Excessive video game players, it's just the terminology throws me off. Excessive video game players, like it's just like excessive gaming, does not typically. These people don't typically suffer severe health consequences as would a hard drug addict, and they are not usually doing anything illegal. Even prior to 2008, when this was written, or 2007, 2008, there are numerous examples of people's lives being like negatively impacted, like people missing their birth of their children, or their children who are suffering, the lack of hygiene. Like there's plenty of examples of why this is not the case, of people actually incurring huge amounts of debt. I mean, this aside, like the whole, like, again, the loot boxes, microtransaction, plenty of people, video games were expensive even back in the day, and if you started busting out the credit card back in 2008 to afford like a nice computer with a nice sound system to play your World of Warcraft with your $15 subscription, while you also simultaneously wanted an Xbox and a PlayStation and all these other things, that sounds kind of problematic if you're really racking up the credit. That aside, that's why I personally think, like, from the outset, it's already wrong. Even back in the day, even putting myself in the lens and through that like retrospective look of back in the day, people do suffer from those things. Those who liked losing track. So they use this term, those who liked losing track of time reported that they found it a relaxing experience. So they're trying to say like that it was like a good thing, which it can be. I think that video games can be a great form of coping. We've definitely seen that with a lot of people. Like video games are a nice way for people to relax and enjoy themselves and have social environments, interact with others. Like awesome things come from video games. But by calling it those who like losing track of time, it's like, do they like losing track of time because they enjoy the game, and so they're actually someone who just likes playing the game, or they like which do they actually enjoy? Like, do they sit down and be like, I am a person who likes losing track of time? I've never heard anyone say that personally. Maybe he has, I don't know. Maybe he runs in certain academic circles that people liked back in the day to lose track of time. So I think it's kind of a loaded term, personally. Half of the players use strategies to limit how much time they spent playing, such as setting alarms or getting someone to interrupt them after a set period of time. What about the other half? They just kind of ignore that. They just like leave it at that, like that this other small subsect of people isn't a problem. And this shows how the intensity at which games can control someone's time when you have behavioral modifications to address this. Meaning, like if you have to set like schedules and things to like limit you and alerts and all these things to bring you away from the game, then it seems like this person's statement here is already like wrong. Like it's already coming at it from the wrong angle of like, why would you need to do that unless it's not actively taking away someone's free time, that they feel the need to set those kind of alarms and have those kind of reminders? Like, is that not an issue? I'm not saying all these things because I believe that video game like compulsion, addiction, whatever you want to call it, is so insanely problematic for everyone in the world that this is like, this person must be wrong. And again, I think that healthy level of skepticism is good, but clearly this person was going like really far on the other side of like, nope. But I think this specific article is the best kind of retrospective look at this stuff, and that's why I'm kind of focusing on it so much. But anyways, determining whether or not the time spent playing video games is having a negative effect is actually quite difficult to ascertain, as it is often a question of individual value judgment rather than objective measurement. They bring that up a lot, of how this has to be a value judgment based on other people, because typically what he's, I guess, arguing is that I as an individual wouldn't think that I have a problem. I would think that other people would think that I have a problem. I think there's other metrics you can use aside from that. I don't know why he's just focusing on that. I mean, there's other substance use issues or gambling, and people can value that as well, but you can also have other metrics that would gauge whether or not this can be problematic behavior. So I think that is a little odd to kind of just gloss over that there is other measurements, on top of the fact that one person can view this as an issue. Like, I can still view my own stuff as an issue, and I think that's what you'd see in a lot of people, is that they'd be more than willing to admit that they have an issue. One might even say that it is the parent's duty to teach their child how to manage their time effectively. This is not, I don't know, I have such an issue with that statement in general. It's a huge value judgment on that part, because again, it sounds like he's even framing this whole thing from the perspective of a child, and while that could be difficult for children, a lot of what I see people talking about this issue is as adults. Like, yeah, it can be problematic as a child, but I guess as long as your grades are taken care of, like maybe some socializing here and there, kids have a lot of free time. I mean, I would be viewing this whole thing more through the lens of adults trying to deal and cope and try to have successful lives. Like, that's when it becomes, in my opinion, way more problematic. Kind of like gambling. You couldn't give a gambling addiction to a child, because I don't think children usually have access to that kind of money and to destroy their life. They can do things in different ways, and they can still have substance use issues, but that's just a weird value judgment to have. I don't like that one at all, personally. Next issue it sounds like I'm just complaining here. For example, a young child may find it hard not to suck their thumb. Many people find it difficult not to eat snacks between meals, limit the amount of coffee that they drink or the salt that they put on the meals. Some may drive the car to the shop when they really should walk. I mean, again, these are issues not really related to time. And again, this is not to point out the fact that there's a huge value proposition in this now versus sucking your thumb versus salt on a meal. There is a huge value component to that, which is another entirely separate part, and I get that now it's much easier to make that argument considering things like microtransactions, like they didn't really have back in the day. However, these are all, like, none of these are time-based issues. Like, with video games, that's why this is a terrible comparison to make in the first place, is because games are naturally, like, when it becomes problematic is because it's taking way too much time, which, again, is kind of contradicting what he said earlier, because he admits that it's a time-based issue, but he's trying to compare this to other issues that have nothing to relate to with time being the primary factor and the primary thing that you are losing out on. And the next part here, he says, video games can be used as a means of escape in order to cope with a range of issues, from everyday stress relief to complete avoidance of daily, up to complete avoidance of daily responsibilities. I mean, you're setting one of the behavioral markers right there. Coping, awesome thing to do with video games. That's fine. That's no issues there. But when you're saying everyday stress relief to complete avoidance, so upwards to complete avoidance. Stress relief, one thing. Coping, complete avoidance of daily responsibilities. That's when it's more of like, hey, completely avoiding all of daily responsibilities. That is the part where we're getting into like behavioral markers. I mean, you're trying to say that this isn't an issue because of this, yet you're just giving us markers of things that we can actually like address and actually use as a marker and some sort of measurement. Interesting. And now we come to one that's personal favorite here. First of all, is there something about video games that makes playing them problematic for people who are not having other difficulties in coping with their lives? So kind of what he's saying here is this shouldn't be an issue. Like if this is actually an issue, then we should have plenty of examples of people who the only issue that they're dealing with is the video game addiction thing, which is odd considering a lot of these other issues. Again, I've kind of alluded to this fact earlier, that a model that we're moving towards is the idea that substance use or addictions, which I don't even like to call it that, is a representation or a manifestation of other issues, like say depression, for instance. So by that logic, you can have both issues at the same time. And I've already alluded to this, already talked about that would be the one thing that you would want to hit anyways. And you can at the same time, you could address both issues. I mean, and if the video games is the manifestation, then that's clearly what you want to address as you dig deeper and deeper down to the actual depression or anxiety or whatever the issue is. So I find that just a little weird that like that's the only kind of thing that you want to judge it based on. But anecdotally, I'm well aware of plenty of people that I've personally met or know, friends, whatever, that have had that issue. I mean, when I was dealing with this and suffering with this issue on my own life in my own terms, I wasn't really depressed. Didn't have anxiety at the time. I had everything I could functionally want. It was more of like kind of lost feeling, and I would just end up spending 16 hours a day on World of Warcraft. I'm not saying that means that other people have an issue. I'm just saying for me, I personally found that problematic for myself. Lastly, the author goes into these little these kind of, I guess, profiles, these stories of individuals, obviously different names or whatever. Names have been changed, but we have four. We have Martin, Helen, Bruce, Alex. So Martin plays World of Warcraft. He lacks social skills. So we'll look at each one of these real fast and just kind of say like why use these as examples. Are they good examples? Are they not good examples of what the author's actually trying to get across? All right, so this is Martin. He's 11. He plays too much World of Warcraft. He plays a lot of it because that's how he's made his friends, because he doesn't have that many friends in real life. In this case, he has he finds a lot more success virtually, and he's been being bullied during this time. All that's understandable. You see that a lot. That's not unheard of for this, and plenty of people find those escapes or those social interactions super useful. And I applaud the author in his little commentary section about Martin. He does talk about the fact that the parents were overly focused on the video game playing, which is true. Like you see that a lot where it's like, oh, the symptom is the issue, and it's like, yeah, there's some deeper stuff, and fair enough, but still something that the author avoids talking about, because he's like, well, he might have an issue, and it's like, well, let's pretend that he's playing, every waking moment he's not at school. Socializing, great. Coping, great. But like at a certain point, if it's going to be valuable for him, especially back in the day in 2008 when they didn't realize that the whole world's going to have to go online, the idea of having social skills would have been an important thing to pass on to a child at this age. Up until that point, until 2008, the whole world really revolved around the ability to have social skills when you're trying to get jobs and stuff. There really wasn't as much remote work and experience. You can make an argument now, but back when he was writing this, no, like you still would want to have the ability for this kid to develop social skills at his school, and while also reducing or addressing the video game playing. Now, the parent, he does make a really valid point that the parents, again, are overly concerned about it, and this is something like you see a lot with technology now, social media and phones. It's like the parents are like, let's take it away. It's clearly the root of all their problems. I've actually heard parents say that it's the root of all their problems, and it's like, maybe reduce it, and then try to focus on the other stuff, like the depression, the connection issues, the social factors. Yeah, I'm sure it can add a lot of, I guess, dysfunction or concerns. It can create a lot of issues with social media, but the complete reduction and limiting that is, usually not in the person's best interest from what I've seen. I mean, if you have a kid and that's how they relate to and understand their peers, especially now through social media. And again, World of Warcraft was basically a social media site back in 2008. Like, that's how people talked and hung out and did stuff. So I'm kind of relating the two. You don't want to completely just remove the person from that unless it's really, really bad. But I mean, even then, it's like you want, the idea is harm, what they call harm reduction. It's I won't say newer, but it's something that the industry is like changing and turning towards. Is this idea of harm reduction with, say, substance use or gambling. It's saying like harm reduction is going to be more effective than pure abstinence, because the idea of abstinence comes from this very moralistic kind of point of view instead of something that's like in the best interest and the more realistic thing to address with someone. But that's different discussion. But kudos to the author to point out that the parents were a little too focused on that as an issue. So let's see. The next one is Helen. Helen is a 32-year-old British female who is actually I think a medical doctor. Interesting. So long story short with this one, a lot of mental health issues because of events that happen in their life, and they needed time to focus on themselves, and they utilized the video game as a coping skill, and they're going through a lot of difficult crap, and the mom was viewing it as the problem being the video game. And this is another example of the author pointing out, rightly so, honestly, and to the author's credit, that, you know, this other person who wasn't Helen was focusing on the game, and the game really wasn't the issue. Now, it's kind of weird that he's cherry picking these instances and not actually finding people who are like, hey, like, no, it's just an issue through and through, and like that's really where it is, and it's not this other breakup or this, you know, other issue or substance use or terrible, you know, family relations or bullying at school. Like, he never really brings up just a plain old case of someone just like, nah, I just play way too many video games. Another one, Bruce, he's 42. Another really good example, however, still cherry picked, still avoiding like just using an example of someone who just has an issue. But this is also a good example, so I will give him credit that this is Bruce. He's 42, playing EverQuest at the time, having an issue. He saw some stuff about video game addiction. Is video game addiction like a terrible thing? Is it killing me? And then, like, you know, him and his wife talked about it. And they're like, oh, well, maybe it is. And this is a good example of why people shouldn't self-diagnose themselves, and why they should seek actual mental health professionals, because you shouldn't do that. And to start claiming things are or aren't, or using media as like your source of understanding for things like addiction, probably not the best source. So it's a good example of like why you shouldn't see the word video game addiction and immediately jump to there's a problem. But it is also, again, cherry picking and avoiding what actually is, which is someone who just has a problem playing video games. And yet again, it's an author, a 10-year-old boy. The author just points out something very valid and very useful with Alex, this 10-year-old, who's saying, hey man, like, yeah, you might have an issue because your dad was away in Iraq. Like, he's going on tour in Iraq in 2008. Your kid has problems. They see a change in behavior. They assume the video games, because I think in this example, he's specifically talking about media, meaning like the parent sees this craze about addiction and video games causing violence, especially around this time. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's clearly not the issue. Clearly, like, the idea that the parent's gone, literally like half of the support system is gone, the person they rely on, and is in Iraq. A very, again, cherry-picked example, and that's the last one. There's no other relevant information that the author uses, and no case examples of someone who actually is like, yeah, bro, start to finish, I just played too many video games. I got a good life, I got this, but I got a good job, but like I really avoid like brushing my teeth all the time. I really want to like work out, or, you know, like I'm really getting behind on the bills, you know, like I haven't, just this idea of it progressively getting worse and it being the game centered around it. And it's just weird that they didn't use that as an example. So I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's just them specifically or what. This is like the best representation of how academia viewed it. And I'm not saying every academic back in 2008, this is how they viewed it, but this is a good representation of what you're going to expect. And like I said earlier, like, people discussed this one. This one was like heavily referenced and cited. There was other articles written about this article, and we're going to look at one of those. And so here we have is one of those responses. It is a commentary response to problems with concept of video game addiction. Some case study examples by Alex. I can't pronounce that last name, I'm sorry. This is them responding to the previous one we just looked at. It was weird because I was expecting a response like, oh, they're going to tear it apart, heck yeah, man. And I started reading and it's like, no, that's not the case. They're just kind of reaffirming a lot of the stuff. One specific one is, video gaming is no different from other activities in a broad range of domains designed to enhance performance. For example, billiards, golf, tennis, or basketball. So this person is comparing, again, they're just kind of adding to the previous author. I don't want to say it's a commentary. I don't know why they called it a commentary, but anyways, so they're comparing it to some other activities that humans do that we try to improve and enhance our performance. And so what I said, I'm like, okay, you're comparing it, right? So video gaming does not involve risking an item of value on the outcome of a chance event. Disagree. Rather, it is a skill-based game designed to improve individual performance or compete against others in a multiplayer interactive game. Sometimes multiplayer, not always. In this respect, video gaming is no different from other activities, such as those ones that he listed a little while ago. I wrote earlier when I guess read this for the first time. I put, yes, the classic example of playing basketball and you receive a randomized piece of loot with a percentage chance to drop when you dunk on your opponent. Every time you get that dunk on someone, you randomly get like a new basketball or jersey. I forgot about that part. And again, this is why these people, they don't know the medium well enough. They can't just blanket statement this stuff. This is an issue when you're talking about video games, is that the idea is so broad and vast, and the one that's referenced so often, which is World of Warcraft, within that game, they're completely ignoring the fact that there's random loot. Like, that's one of that was the most popular game at the time, and they're ignoring the fact that one, that people, all the addiction talking and the violence and all blah blah blah, that was a game that you had randomized loot. And that already defeats all the other things: billiards, golf, tennis, basketball, any sport that you play. There's no randomized loot that's generated from it that keeps you wanting to play. It's not as accessible, but I'll get to that. I'll get to that point in a second. The next one is video gaming does not involve risking an item of value on the outcome of a chance event. I think I read that a second ago. So if gambling away money is okay, why is gambling away your time okay? I just don't agree with that statement. You definitely risk time when you play these things, especially if, say, you're like, I'm going to go into back in 2005, I'm going to go into a raid. I'm going to hope that this classic WoW raid is going to be fruitful for me, and I get all this stuff done and not rage at all and get all the loot that I want, which none of that really happens, right? It's a disaster, it's a nightmare, everyone dies, and you don't get the loot that you want. You're definitely chancing something when you do that. I mentioned skill rating earlier. You definitely chance that, and the item of value again is more of like your time, and even then, I mean, I guess it's very rare that I guess you're putting up like loot on the table, which loot is representative of like real life items and stuff, because it's time and investment and money, and all that stuff is like just as relevant as I think the time or the actual money you spend during gambling. So I just don't agree with that in the first place. Video gamers may misuse their time and energies playing games as determined by parental value judgments or concerns. Damn, I guess adult gamers didn't exist back in the late 2000s. Like, again, they phrase all this stuff for kids, and I get it because that's the easy target audience, and that's probably the easy one to get funding for if you're trying to do research on video game addiction. Children is like a very natural thing, I would assume, but then again, I think children make it more difficult to do certain research, so I don't know why they keep framing it through the idea of children. Like, most of your problem examples were adults back in the day, back even in the 2000s. Like, that was the examples they would use, is like adults playing World of Warcraft way too long. So the whole thing, I'm not going to go over this one. The author just defends the previous author, and they try to leave the conversation in a murky state of like, we don't know, like, further research required. And so it just adds to the idea that this is an issue back in the day. This is an issue where they really had, and we still have a really poor conception, but specifically speaking back in the day, there was a very, very poor conception of what they were even trying to do with this thing called video game addiction. All right. Our next article comes from, let's see, Measuring Problem Video Game Playing in Adolescence by Ricardo A. Tiajero. I can't pronounce these names. Rosa M. something. They're on the screen. Like, I'm sorry. This one's really quick. I just wanted to bring up one thing real fast, which is our results. This is just the conclusion. That's all I'm pulling up. I mean, you can read this one for yourself. The title's there. You can look at them. You can see it in the video. And it says, this is just the conclusions to their entire discussion here. Our results confirm that excessive use of video games is associated with a number of problems which resembles a dependence syndrome, and the PvP appears as a useful instrument for the measurement of such problems. Just to clarify, they don't mean PvP like player versus player. I thought that was hilarious. This is actually a measurement scale that they created. It just happens to be PvP and about video games, but it was a measurement scale that they're actually looking at and trying to identify this problematic behavior. So, like, the design was they reviewed the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence and for pathological gambling, as well as the literature on the addictions, in order to design a short scale called the Problem Video Game problem video game playing with stupid that is quick and easy to apply. I guess they were literally trying to call it PvP because PvP is a term, and I swear to God that's why they did this. But anyways, so they were just trying to see like the scale. They're going to create a scale based on the old criteria in the old DSM-4 related to gambling. So they were creating their own scale to kind of see, does this thing have some validity and consistency. But the more I research, the more I see scales and measures that have been developed over the years. Like, this is a lot of these research articles and studies are just, they create their own measurement scales, but in the discussion sections, meaning like this is the part of the article, journal article, where you're saying, I'm going to talk about like, the future of this, or like the limitations of the study. Without fail, the authors state basically more info required. Essentially, after decades of research, like, I don't know at what point is enough, and like why the studies always focus on these measurement scales. They always create these measurement scales, and they're like, oh, I'm gonna like prove this or that using like gambling, and it's just such a small group. I don't know it's participants. I mean, they use a lot, like 223. That's cool. That's interesting that they had a lot of participants. I don't know if, again, there's probably a brief survey, like the self-assessment measure they just kind of sent out to people. So, but I haven't seen any really in-depth actual research methodology being applied to any of this stuff. Now, this again was prior to the DSM-5, where now we actually have like something we're trying to work with. This was before, when there really even wasn't something in the DSM. But I find this fascinating. It's just kind of, like that's it. And they're just like, here's a measurement scale, like more info required. That's kind of the gist of this whole one. So I'm not going to dive into anything else about it. All right, so we have another one. It says Development and Validation of a Game Addiction Scale for Adolescents by Jaron S. Slimmons, Patty M. Volkenberg, and Joshin Peter. It's another really quick one about like an actual measurement scale. So the 21-item scale, as well as a shortened 7-item version, showed high reliabilities. Furthermore, both versions showed good concurrent validity across samples. So again, they're just creating a scale. They're trying to verify and validate it. I don't know what I can't remember what they actually used. And it looks like, again, they're taking something from the DSM. Okay, so they're looking at like out in the future. They were assuming and understanding that it was probably going to be placed in the DSM-5. I don't know if they actually pull up the DSM-4. They keep going back to this idea of it being based off of gambling, and they're just creating another scale to create like. And I listened to an interesting podcast pretty recently, much more standard, and I'm not trying to make it more retrospective, more historical, but the podcast was talking about this one of the lead researchers back in the day, I think it was like 2016, back in the day, 5 years ago, was talking about a lot of the research that has been done does this. It's just like, oh, we're going to make a quick scale, we're going to measure it, we're going to get it out, this little questionnaire that we send off to people, it's going to have, it's like, we're going to show it's reliable and valid, and I get to like publish this and have my cake and eat it too, and I'm going to have all the fame and glory that comes along with putting out research, because this is a really quick and not extremely in-depth and heavily, like, it's not heavy on its research methodology, and because of that, low-hanging fruit in the academic world, and that's kind of what he was saying, was a lot of the studies that have been done, even recently, meaning like at that time in 2016 when I think that podcast was recorded, that a lot of the stuff was low-hanging fruit. A lot of these research methodologies are low-hanging fruit, and it wasn't actually about defining and furthering the research about video game addiction. So I thought that was fascinating, and it just appears that even back in the day, it's pretty much the exact same. So again, I'm not going to go through this one. Y'all can read this one yourself, but it's, again, just another one prior to 2010 that's just adding to this idea that we especially then, they did not know and did not understand what video game addiction was. So this one actually was a little bit more in depth. It is Understanding Online Game Addiction Connection Between Presence and Flow by Sung Bak and Ha-Sung Huang. I'm butchering. I am so sorry. So the one thing to note on this one, it was a little bit more in depth because they're actually trying to like do a little bit more in-depth research. I don't know if this is because it was in South Korea and they are taking this concept a little bit more seriously because of the culture there, especially as it relates to video games. But one of the things I wanted to note is they say this study provides empirical evidence supporting the anticipated powerful effect of experience of flow in online games. More importantly, it was found that online game players experience high level of flow state, and their addiction to online games can be explained by the flow experience. This finding seems to be consistent with previous research, and thus the study confirms that Flow might play an important role of addiction to online games. And what is flow, you ask? It is, in positive psychology, a flow state, also known colloquially as being in the zone, is the mental state in which a person performing some activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment of the process of the activity. So this idea of, it's a psychological idea, and they're trying to look at how it relates to games and if it contributes to like what at the time was considered like addiction, which again, it's all based off of the gambling and stuff like that. It really wasn't well defined, so it's hard to even take this at face value, but they actually did include a little bit more rigor, it looks like, in their methodology, but I'm not going to go into that. This is the first study to actually look at and respect the idea of video game addiction, though. The previous ones were like, video game addiction, I don't know. But this one's actually saying, like, no, we think there is this thing called, like, this issue that is video game addiction, and they're actually addressing that and acknowledging that, despite, again, some of the difficulties with the fact that they really haven't defined this too well at this point. Not these people specifically, but the general body of academia hadn't at this point. Maybe arguably still hasn't. And the last one here is an exploration of the tendency to online game addiction due to users' liking of design features. This one was super fascinating. This one was my favorite out of all of them, but I'll do real fast because what they're basically doing is looking at in World of Warcraft, which again, awesome. I love World of Warcraft, but I love that so many of these examples use World of Warcraft. Like, it's just so amazing how prevalent WoW was, and it's sad that it's not. What they did is they're actually trying to look at these different domains of, hey, like, are these things related to addiction at all? Things like narrative, aesthetics, character, interface, interaction. They looked at these 5 pieces and are saying, hey, like, are these related to video game addiction? Do any of these report well with addiction? Meaning that, like, people who self-report they're addicted to a game, does the narrative of WoW, like WoW, World of Warcraft, does the narrative of it entice players more? Do the aesthetics, do the characters, like your character specifically, I think is actually what they're talking about. Yeah, like your character, your role-playing game character specifically, the interface of the game, like how it actually functions, like the user experience, the interaction, meaning social interaction is what they're talking about here. This one was so fast. This one, like, if y'all read one, please read this one because this one's so fascinating. I like, wow, like to see it through the lens of World of Warcraft, especially as it relates to the whole addiction thing and like what they're actually looking at, which was going more in depth, because I think they make a valid distinction that like different parts of a video game or have different pulls on this thing that we call, like, you know, video game fixation. So when you're fixated on a game, like which parts are doing that, which there's plenty of research that has come out after that, but this is one of the first ones I actually saw related to that, and that's what it was so cool. What they found is, like, finally this research suggests that a user's preference for aesthetics, character, and interaction is strongly related with the game addiction and compulsive withdrawal and tolerance symptoms. So they looked at, again, based on gambling, the criteria that was created and crafted for video games, this idea of compulsion, wanting to play, withdrawal, I want to play even though I'm not playing right now, and tolerance, meaning I need more and more of the game to get that same level. And so they're saying, like, aesthetics, character, interaction, what they found is, as it relates to how they set up what even video game addiction means and the symptoms of it, take it with a grain of salt there, but they're saying that what they found is the aesthetics, character, and interaction, social interaction of the game, like, increased the compulsion, withdrawal, and tolerance. Now you can read this yourself, but this was the most fascinating. So highly recommend actually reading this one if you are into academia or just academic papers or even how they did the study. It's super interesting. So, and lastly, I'm going to talk about 2 more things really quick. It's not related to academia. This is in the media. So, like, how did the media view video game addiction prior to 2010? So you can do an advanced search on Google. You can only search for things between, like, you know, a certain year, like or a certain time frame. So I did 2000, the start of 2000 to the end of 2009. So a 10-year time frame of, like, what was in the media at the time. Is video game addiction a mental disorder? But this is by Lindsay Tanner. I think there's some interesting things in here because, again, this is media, and at this time they were kind of blowing up this idea of, you know, addiction and the violence of the games and all that stuff, which this is great. So I'm just going to show you a few quotes from this. I'm not going to go through the whole article, but just look at some of the words. Some of the key parts here is the phrasing, like how they're actually trying to present this to, like, an average viewer. My father was an alcoholic, and I saw exactly the same thing. And we battled him until October of last year. We went to therapist. We tried taking the game away. They're talking about a kid here. And they're not even saying, like, a potential addict. They're just saying, yep, he's a video game. This is back in 2007, I believe. They're just like, yeah, he's an addict, even though there's no formalized definition or even understanding by the American Psychiatric Association of what addiction is for video games. They're like, yep, he's an addict. They just go all in and just call it that. And again, World of Warcraft right here. He's playing too much World of Warcraft. Now that I look back on it, it's like I went out and bought him his first Jack Daniels. Where is that part? Yeah, they literally, like, the parent says this, and they include it into the article. Now they look back on it, it's like I went out and bought him his first Jack Daniels, said the 49-year-old woman who didn't want her name used to spare her son from ridicule. Yeah, ridicule from people who are like, bro, you're crazy. Like, no, I don't want to say crazy. That's a derogatory term. But what I will say is it's a little out there. It's a little out there take to try to compare video game addiction with Jack Daniel. Like, you illegally gave your child alcohol. That's such a huge, and like they know that. That's why they included it in this article. Like, I get the mom, like, she clearly is just worried about her kid, and that's a whole different situation. But then the news site takes it and just twists it and makes it some ridiculous, abhorrent thing. More fear equals more clicks. But so another great one, though, that I'm going to show y'all is, so even some mental health experts say labeling the habit of formal addiction is going too far. So at least they added that. It's one little line. It's a one little sentence, but at least they had the decency to say even some mental health experts say labeling the habit of formal addiction is going too far. But even the one redeeming sentence here, they say even some mental health. Like oh yeah, a little bit of, a few of them are like, oh, I don't know about it. Like, they give it so little credence in this case that it's like as if the whole consensus in the mental health world in 2007 was, yeah, that exists. And it's like, no, it's complete opposite by far. The debate at the time was clearly torn, but this entire media piece was focused on the OMFG, your kid will die. And again, mentions WoW. But I'm not going to go too far into that. They do talk like with an actual physician and stuff, I believe, at some point. They have even a support group listed. But the whole thing is just so dependent. It's so gross. Y'all can read it yourselves. They do add this: the American Medical Association is making premature conclusions without the benefit of complete and thorough data. So at least they add that. Like, there's a few redeeming pieces here, but it's pretty garbage. Like, the whole thing is pretty garbage. And I could just imagine being a scared mother and seeing like an article like this, like, oh my god, the room's messy and it's all slanted and like they playing too long. Next article was, this was an article. It was more of a it was a talk with NPR back in 2007 with Neil Conan. And this one was a lot better. Like, wow. Like, and I expect this from NPR back in the day. Like, this makes sense that this was a lot more, like, a much better take on this. And they actually interview some physicians, people who actually, like, talk and make decisions. Not only that, I think, actually, yeah, Dr. Charles O'Brien, one of the persons they're talking to, was the chairman of the DSM-5 committee on the substance abuse disorders. So he's a massively influential person as it relates to this article back in the day. This is probably one of the most sane conversations, even more sane than, like, all the academic journal articles. So this is one of the doctors. They say, and how did it manifest itself? Talking about some like addiction issues. I'm working with, the majority of them are young men. So talking about these people, like the people I work with who are addicted, as he says. The majority of them are young men, and they come in, they have lost their jobs, lost marriages, dropped out of college or high school, and their lives have fallen apart. They exhibit all the standard characteristics. Their behavior is compulsive. They get a high off of it. They do it in spite of negative consequences, and they really go into withdrawal when they try to cut back or stop playing. Like, this is what should be in the academic journal articles, and this is what you see. There's a difference between practice and actual, like, academia. Like, the practice stuff is like your practitioner, like myself as a therapist. You see these issues and you try to go read about it, and you're like, wow, this is so like far removed from like what I see in like reality. And it's hard because you have to be objective and you have to use all the research methodologies to make sure it's objective and stuff. And I get that. I understand that point, but this person's saying, no, like, these are the adults. This is the real issues. This is like how it really is. I'm not sugarcoating it, but I'm also not like using a bunch of flair and a bunch of like, oh my God, we're all going to die kind of language that like the news media would. And the other one, it's a very well thought out and well deserved piece here. And like, they did such a good job. This whole article, if you actually want to like listen to something, like if you're interested in historical video game addiction stuff, which it seems like such a small subsect of people, if you are interested in that, this is a great one to look at. Another piece where they say, so I'm certain that the video games that people enjoy are activating the reward system. The question is, do they do it in as intense a way so as to provoke these compulsions that they see with drugs? So this is another example of how the discussion was representative of the idea that there is a balance to be had with this discussion. And moving forward when you move forward, it requires more understanding with the literature. Meaning he's trying to say, like, he's trying to propose real valid questions of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. Like he wants to actually understand, is this a symptom of things, and is this like its own standalone diagnosis, or is it's such a better talk, it's such a better conversation. And he's really affirming and understanding this idea. He doesn't shy away from it. He really believes in it, despite the fact that he also states that it needs further research, but research in the right direction to actually move it forward. And so like that is just fantastic to see back in the day. This is the only like the most sane piece that I have in this entire video was from them. Detox for video game addiction. This was by Sherry Raw, reviewed by Louis Chang, medical doctor. This is back in like 2006, I believe. Yes, 2006. Let me point out a few things. Again, this was a little bit more. It's not quite as crazy as the first article, but not as like well balanced as like the second one I just showed you. I even highlighted it. Too much gaming may seem relatively harmless compared with the dangers of a drug overdose, but Baker says video game addiction can ruin lives. Children who play 4 to 5 hours per day have no time for socializing, doing homework, or playing sports. He says that takes away from normal social development. You can get a 21-year-old with the emotional intelligence of a 12-year-old. I mean, that's kind of intense, but the point is he's kind of affirming what I said earlier about the idea that one, in adults, that's when you really see the issue, and two, it's great as a coping skill, it's great to socialize, but there's a point even with children where you're like, I need to figure out where the limit and the line is for myself. And that is hard because it's very subjective, and I get that, but he's saying that there is a point. This physician saying there is a line. In older addicts, compulsive gaming can jeopardize jobs, relationships. They say Howard, a 33-year-old project manager who asked to be identified only by his first name, started playing an online role-playing game about 6 months ago. He plays for 3 to 4 hours almost every day, more on weekends, occasionally putting off meals or sleep. Those are pretty obvious signs, especially if you're avoiding like meals and sleep. Like for myself, like y'all got to make this decision for yourself, or go see a mental health professional. But like, if I'm trying to craft behavioral markers, I think losing sleep and meals, avoiding massive like important things that you care about, like your family and stuff like that, your ADLs, your activities of daily living, if you're avoiding that stuff, that's when to me it becomes more of an issue. One example of like how they're having a more serious conversation than that in that first piece that we saw. It does highlight 2 points. One reinforces a previous article that at the time and still for some, the idea of video game addiction is viewed through the lens of those around the person playing the game. So it kind of does lend back into that of like his fiance says he's addicted. Like that part, that's the one thing I would pull out of this. It's like you shouldn't. I agree with the author, the first author, not the first author, but the big article that I looked at. I agree that you shouldn't necessarily view it through another person's perspective because it's very personal and it's very subjective. And because of that, you have to be objective about the individual. I don't like that specific line, but that's about it. In addition, video game addicts tend to become isolated, dropping out of their social networks and giving up other hobbies. This usually is the person's new hobby, and calling people addicts has definitely fallen from grace. So there's just a few things about this article. It's clearly old in its time. I'm not trying to pick it apart because it's old, but they use addicts a little too much, and we don't really say that anymore. There's a balance to be had between something that's genuinely hobby, like the world's largest form of entertainment, versus like labeling it as an addiction. I get all that, but none of that nuance is in this article. I wanted to see how people within these communities kind of viewed it at the time. So again, I used the search terms 2000 to 2009, at the end of 2009, and I looked at forums. So I have a few here, and I wanted to share just some things that people were talking about back in the day when they were talking about video game addiction. So this is on MMORPG discussion, how to overcome an addiction. So people were talking about this back in the day. They're like, how do I overcome addiction? Game addictions are currently the fastest growing class of addictions. This person outlines a lot of stuff that's actually pretty forward thinking that I didn't even see any of the articles. Like they're saying, hey, like this is an issue. Like we in this community view this as an issue. So I'm like, that's cool. Like that was awesome to see that people genuinely talking about that. And sometimes you'll see that in communities prior to, especially before it gets to academia, and even before it gets to the news, you're going to see this in communities where like this is an issue that we've seen in like our people, our group, our community, that this is a problem way before you see it in the news or even especially academia. This person's really rude, stop playing, simple as that. And it is simple. If it isn't, you lack maturity and willpower, and you'll make excuse after excuse not to quit. No one else can fix an addiction for you. Any addiction. Like this person's clearly very opinionated. Not trying to, pinpoint this person out. Don't go hate on anyone. Like hopefully they've changed their tune over time. Very odd thing. And this person says no, replying to that. No, the idea is that this post is for people who can't. You are basically flaming people who cannot quit. Of course, it's easy for someone like you and me maybe, but that doesn't mean that it can't make people sick. I've also heard people say the exact same thing you just said, who are addicted themselves and couldn't identify it yet. That's nice. That's cool of them. So this person's a little cynical, thinking that it's just to make more money. If you're able to curtail your playing and wean yourself off it, then it's not really an addiction, it's a hobby. So again, this person's kind of ignoring the fact that some people don't and can't. Well, can't in the sense that like they just have to get to the point where they can. There's no such thing as MMO addiction. People play MMOs excessively to the detriment of their health and other aspects of their life, or suffering from a compulsion disorder and have fixated on MMOs. Okay, so this person's saying that it's not an addiction, it's more of a compulsion, which I guess you could make an argument for that. That's interesting. MMO addiction is something that is very easy to acquire, and I suspect that it's far more widespread than we know. Again, very, very forward thinking at the time. Fortunately, as one of the easiest to solve, I can share what I've learned. Oh, that's really... So, there's some cool stuff in here. There's some trolls. There's some flaming that used to happen. There's some people just outright denying things. There's people who have different perspectives. It's pretty nice. I get the impression that a lot more hardcore MMO players have never really fitted into the real world either. And this kind of adds to the idea that this is a social place for people to meet, talk, and understand other humans, even if it's difficult for them outside of that. So the easiest way to overcome MMORPG addiction is to find yourself another addiction. Works 100% of the time. Obviously humorous. He's joking, but yeah, this is a nerd or just plain bored rune tips back in the RuneScape days apparently. So a lot of it's talking about like no-lifing. A skill is basically ignoring everything else going on in life to play RuneScape. So they're talking about no-lifing, which is what we would call like the compulsion or whatever at this point. No-lifing a skill, basically ignoring everything else going on in life to play RuneScape. Obviously, the problem is that everyone sees something with a skill cape and doesn't see how much effort they put into it, so they assume that the person ignored their life to just play RuneScape. That's a pretty normal idea of looking at someone who has some really cool gear in a MMO and being like jealous of them. But because that's kind of like a derogatory, like a no-lifer, like you're just good because you sit there and play the video game all day, which could be fair, could not be, I don't know. The no-life term has no sense whatsoever. I mean, if you don't have a life, then you must be buried in a cemetery. LOL. Only thing that relates to the term is addicted. Being addicted to anything is bad or dangerous. So I mean, that part I agree with. You know, like including sports and healthy stuff. You can have a compulsion towards healthy things, right? At least you can't die if you are a no-lifer. That's, I guess, older humor. I don't know. So again, they're just kind of trying to discuss this idea of like, at what point is it too far? That's kind of what this community looks like they're talking about. Is like, at what point is playing RuneScape in this case going too far for them individually? But in truth, spending 5 hours a day playing in the same thing to playing a console game 5 hours a day in my mind. Okay, so this is back in the day. There was that debate between like people who played on PC were considered like no-lifing it versus people who would play like the same amount in like Halo 3 or something. So you're playing Halo 3 back on the Xbox, like that was cool, that was fine, that was acceptable. But like there was a socially unacceptable thing like MMOs or anything on the PC. So this is an Xbox achievements forum back in the day, smearing gamers. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm tired of this campaign that's trying to prove that gaming makes people deviants. First we were all homicidal maniacs, now we're being paired with addicts like gamblers. I laughed at the part above that said gamer youth skipped chores and lied to parents. That seems like normal behavior for most kids, regardless of whether or not they play video games. It's a good point. It's a fair point that like people like the path of least resistance. We don't want to do things that are harder. So if your parents like do chores and you're like no, and if you're playing video games versus playing a sport, like I get this person. They're saying don't make deviants out of us. Don't make us to be like homicidal maniacs, and don't make us to be like we're addicts. Or fair enough. Actually, a very valid point. And again, that's kind of the balance we're talking about with this issue is don't label like a hobby an issue. But on the flip side, at what point is it gone too far? All I have to say is if something is illegal, kids will want to do it because it's more fun. Okay, oh, interesting. Okay. Anyway, if you want kids to stop cutting class, make school fun. School is freaking boring. Okay, this person's just complaining about school. Yeah, I'm tired of the crap about video games doing this. Every single kid tries to skip their chores. So again, a lot of people kind of echo chambering this. The only thing gaming has ever done to me over the years is make me prone to excessive swearing, but that's mostly my fault also. I mean, people being pretty lighthearted up in here, nothing too terrible. The kids, yeah, there was a story recently where some kid shot some kids in school, and oh god, okay. They said he did it because he wanted to get points for his KD, so he went. Yeah, that's. There again, they're talking about media like overhyping this thing, especially back in the day. Like it was really focused on the danger aspects because it was kind of linked and grouped with the violence thing that was going on during the time. Okay, judging by the replies, some people won't be thanking me for the following posts, but what the hell? I think they could be on to something. I'm not saying the article is proof or anything, or even giving the right statistics, but they do make a point. Example, a friend of mine played a lot of Counter-Strike a couple years ago, was part of a top-ranked clan, was one of the better Dutch players, but when I said a lot, I meant all the freaking time. He didn't go to school, he just so he would avoid school to play CS, and had to do a year of school over because of it. So that's addictive behavior, compulsive need to play the game, and cutting classes, same as chores. Not to mention all the people who dedicate no less than their actual real life to games like World of Warcraft. So yeah, I mean, this is cool. Like forums are, I love forums. I mean, yeah, there was some weird stuff and some trolls and some people just making jokes and stuff, but there was some real conversation going on even back in the day. This is just a blog post about video game addiction, if it's a mental disorder. I'm not reading the thing, but I'm just looking at some stuff. I had been with my husband for 3 years, and he has been gaming. This is 2010, so it's a little past my date or whatever, but whatever. I've been with my husband for 3 years, and he has been gaming for 6 years. I recently made him leave WoW, and he bought a 360 so he could play games together and interact with people together, and he absolutely hates it. I see a psychiatrist for anxiety, depression, PTSD, and I'm not sure whether instead of whether to tell my therapist about his addiction to WoW. Now he throws down the controller and is getting violent and cussing. That's a whole different issue. Like that's yeah. So again, this is people viewing it through the lens of like video game is issue. And I get that. Like you don't want to say video game is issue. You want to say is there other issues? Maybe reduce gaming to address other issues? Like fair point. So video game addiction or VGA mental disorder, I wouldn't say that, but maybe it could become a mental disorder after a long playtime of video games, only if the person really suffers and can't live without it. I mean, again, there was some genuine discussion happening back in the day related to these topics. With that in mind, I've done a very long video looking at and chronicling and taking this retrospective look at the historical pieces of video game addiction in the past from 2000 to 2010. I added a little bit of stuff before, a little bit of stuff after. Before and after both of those things, but that's the kind of general range I was hitting, and I hope this was informative to anyone who cares. My follow-up video is going to be about how it's currently viewed. I'm really curious about how it's currently viewed. I understand a little bit about it, but I'm going to dive into more research on it. So if people are interested in this, it's an extremely long video. I might even make a shorter video to just quickly pop off on some like big pieces here, because this is long. But I think this is important because it's like, hey, this is where we come from. This is the area that we all derive this idea of video game addiction from, and it's important in our world, especially the more and more video games and this idea of the metaverse is getting kind of like melded together. You know, Microsoft purchased Activision Blizzard, and Bobby Kotick, the current CEO of Activision Blizzard, was like, metaverse. Like, clearly this is something that's going to get even more difficult to parse out and distance yourself from. And if the largest entertainment industry in the entire world can lobby for this stuff, this is something that we need to talk about, because it's not in their best interest to label a hobby an addiction. I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just we have to take this from a really realistic standpoint and try to see, is this actually an issue, and not let the money persuade anything or change anything, because I think the WHO, World Health Organization, has made it more formalized versus the DSM-5 here for America. So it's a little interesting. So we'll see in the next video what this kind of talks about and what this relates to, but I hope this was informational from an academic standpoint, from how the media kind of portrayed it briefly, and how people talked about it in forums back in the day, just general non-academic people just discussing this as an issue. So I hope you found a lot of value in this. If you stuck around at this point, thank you, because this is like not highly academic, but it's pretty in-depth. It's pretty boring, and I'll hopefully edit out all the boring stuff. But if you found this video useful, please do all that stuff, like, subscribe, but definitely watch the other one. That's something I care about more. Like, watch the other one because I care about this stuff, and I spent obviously a lot of time doing this. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a great day. Peace.